Kia ora. This presentation explores some of the issues around medium and long-term community change in the context of large-scale mining, drawing on my now rather extended experience in Papua New Guinea. As you can see from the slide, this has empirical dimensions, what changes are evident over different time periods, a methodological dimension, what sorts of changes and how do we track them through time, and a conceptual dimension. How do we understand the processes and transformations, their origin and drivers, and importantly, who is the we that is doing the defining, tracking, and conceptualizing? Okay, here's an extended proposition, if you like, or rationale for why we don't know much about the medium term, the Durée Moyenne, if you like, as opposed to shorter time period snapshots of impact and conflict. Firstly, then extraction is central to the global economy and a multitude of local economies, and it isn't going away, even post-COVID. Secondly, there's a large amount of scholarship and policy on the complexities of large-scale mining. Hence, we understand much better now the ways in which mining affects communities, the impacts, dislocations, ruptures, and novel forms of economy, relationships, and opportunity. Thirdly, conflict has become a central organising motif or theme for much of this work, for good reason, but I will suggest not unproblematically. This understanding largely relies on relatively short-term studies, snapshots if you like, of communities and the stresses they are experiencing. Historically, it was rare to have systematic, academic, long or medium-term, and by that I mean intergenerational, type of work on aspects of mining. This is changing, as evidenced here in this conference. And finally, the relative absence of long-term research is a consequence of intersecting institutional factors that I list out here, but I won't dwell on those. So this leads to the final part of my opening proposition. Why does this matter? Why do we need to track the medium term in relation to these mines? Well, there are two significant reasons why this longer term view is necessary. Firstly, it's often intergenerational aspects of change that are an initial focus of community engagement with large-scale mining. By this I mean that communities sometimes can see ways in which mining operations may offer the prospect of greater opportunities for their children. I've heard community members say that they hope the mine will improve the economic, the health and the educational prospects for their children, for example. If this is the case, understanding these intergenerational changes is important. Secondly, and not unrelatedly, consistent attention to the transformations that communities go through over decades, including giving attention to their shifting perceptions, aspirations, and concerns, is obviously needed to better inform policy, practice, and operational responses. So in terms of this presentation, I'll now provide a little background to the mining sector in Papua New Guinea and an introduction to Porgera. Then I come back to the three aspects of the task of monitoring medium-term change that I opened with. Some empirical questions around transformations, methodological questions that arise, and finally some closely related conceptual questions as to how do we understand community transformation in this context and other contexts as well. So for those of you who have little knowledge of Papua New Guinea and its mining sector, Papua New Guinea is a nation of around 8 million people that has been independent since 1975. Right from then, it has been a heavily resource-dependent economy, and currently around 40% of its exports are derived from mining and another 44% from petroleum, especially natural gas. Its place in the formal economy, that is mining's place in the formal economy, is central, with important contributions to GDP and government revenue, although there's a side story about government revenue from the sector in the last 5 years. In some recent work with a colleague, Pierre-Yves Lemeur, we have argued that the sector really functions as an enclave across three different dimensions. Materially, as in the classic notion of a resource enclave, as well as environmentally, institutionally in terms of its governance, and finally, ideologically within the nation state. Again, I won't go into those, but they're an important element of the way in which the sector functions within Papua New Guinea. This is a relatively recent map of the Papua New Guinea mining landscape, showing operating mines and prospects. Up towards the top left-hand side of the screen is the Porgera gold mine that I'll be focusing on in the rest of this presentation. Porgera then. It began construction, the large-scale mine began construction in 1989, and by 1992 it was the third largest gold producer in the world and the largest outside South Africa. Its history can be told in many different ways. There are complex layers to any narrative we tell of Porgera. Corporate ownership, for one, has shifted more than a dozen times, and the only constant thread in that time is a 5% shareholding held by the local community and the provincial government. Politically, Porgera has been in the headlights on several occasions. The PNG state threatened the corporate partners to hand over a greater equity share to the state in 1992. And again, most recently, the government has refused to renew the mining lease, which effectively has chased the current corporate owners, Canadian and Chinese, out of the operation. While the mine has been lauded as a technological, financial, and operational leader at different points in time over the past 30 years, it's also come under international scrutiny for its environmental management, with riverine tailings disposal and erodible waste dumps polluting nearby river systems with sediment and mine tailings. And finally, there's a complex and lengthy history of conflict and violence within the community and between the state, community, and company on the ground, with the occasional intervention of international groups in the scene, something I'll return to shortly. Here's just one example of one of the axes of conflict at Porgera, with decades-long tension between small-scale miners, here labelled as illegal miners, which is technically correct, and the company. These blow-ups are frequent. There's usually one or two a year of note between the miners and the mining company, the large-scale mining company. Porgera, in a sense, has come to be defined by these conflicts and has been a site of irregular academic and NGO interest over the past 30 years. Some highlights would include, from the mid-1990s, international environmental NGOs which have focused on the impact on the river system and downstream communities. In the late 1990s, the issue of the loss of the alluvial mining resource became a flashpoint. Then in the last 2 decades, much of the conflict has been around the small-scale miners on the large-scale lease, with regular conflict and deaths. The news report on the previous slide referred to this. In the last decade, a particular international human rights spotlight has been on assaults and rapes of local women by corporate security forces, and led to a controversial, high-profile corporate remedy framework negotiated with the women. Alongside this, over the past 30 years, there's been some international journalistic attention too, almost always around these NGO campaigns, built for or constructed for international audiences, and playing very much on primitivist tropes. As I was about to go up to Porgera from Port Moresby about 10 years ago, I picked up the Sydney Morning Herald to read that I was about to head into what the paper labelled, the journalist labelled, the Valley of Death. And more recently, a Canadian journalist opined that Porgera was about to, quote, slide immediately into the dark ages. My concern with this potted history of narratives of Porgera is that it misses the notion of Porgera as a lived place, or more correctly, a place where people live for the past 30 years. Yes, there are constant and changing low-level frustrations and the occasional violent episodes with frequent deaths reported and ongoing tribal fighting, some of which is certainly related to the direct and indirect effects of the mine. The extent of the environmental devastation has incrementally increased too, despite the occasional hysteria that an international NGO or journalist generates. Nothing changes. Despite all this, and in amongst it all, people and communities continue to carve out lives and livelihoods, shifting and changing ones, across the decades at Porgera. Some recent work I've been involved in points to many of the continuities from pre-mine Porgera around which lives are built. There are 2 I'll briefly touch on here. First, Porgera has always been a place of migration, with people settling in or moving away from the valley. And the past 30 years are no different. The scale, though, is very different, with at least a 10-fold increase in population over the past 4 decades. This in-migration is complex, as both a driver of social political, cultural changes within the landowner communities, and as a central focus of blame by the community and the company for much of the violence and the social ills of Porgera, with at least some justification. And less well understood, but equally important in terms of individuals and families at Porgera, has been the outmigration, particularly by those who can. Anecdotally, at least, migration away from Porgera remains an aspiration for many of the landowners and is achieved by some of them. Again, the extent of this is just not clear. There hasn't been work done on the migration of Porgerans away from Porgera over the last 40 years, which has been facilitated by revenue flows from the mine. The continuing importance of land at Porgera is also marked. Land in these resource contexts becomes a marker of identity, literally in the sense that locals become inscribed as land owners, and those outside the lease as non-land owners. Recent work has confirmed again that while patterns of access and connections to land have shifted, land is still critical for those with fewer material resources. It serves a subsistence economic role, but is also socially and economically important in terms of connections between landowners and migrants. Importantly, land and the social relationships that coalesce around it form the structural basis for many livelihoods, far more so than the effects of conflict or other ephemeral events. This points to the longer term, more gradual, decadal length transformations within which events, ruptures, and conflicts sit. In a similar vein, Alex Golub, an anthropologist with lengthy experience at Porgera, wrote recently that while the single-issue NGO campaigns were important, the multitude of obdurate and structurally unjust conditions that persist at Porgera are, in his words, even more worthy of attention. Right, turning briefly to some methodological issues raised by my concern with the tracking of the medium and long term in terms of societal transformations around these mine sites. The 7 points here are something of a methodological manifesto and revolve around the question of who should do this work. Who is the we that I spoke of at the start of this presentation? The first point is the need to build long-term, abiding collaborative relationships and networks for this work. Networks and relationships that extend into the community, local and international academics, NGOs, students, policymakers, government, industry. I've been a part of numerous attempts to construct social monitoring type frameworks, and they've not abided. This is in many respects the most difficult aspect of the equation, getting that sustainable set of relationships going. And related to this, I'm strongly of the opinion that this work needs to be government mandated or it won't get done, corporate funded or it won't get funded, community led and directed or it won't be meaningful, and academically co-designed so it can tap into leading comparative ideas from elsewhere. Third, don't underestimate the institutional constraints to this type of work. There are everything from university ethics frameworks, from corporate and government turnover and amnesia, and usually limited commitment of long-term funding bodies for this kind of longitudinal work. The central need to build local capacity to lead this work is critical, and facilitating ways for communities to have more tools and power to direct change is what it should really all be about. Fifth, learn from and build on previous work, please. Too often projects, academic and NGO, start as if nothing had been done previously at different mine sites. I've seen it over and over and over again at Porgera. Keep in mind, as point 6, that it's politics, stupid. Everything is about politics. So these, the long-term monitoring and research frameworks built around this kind of work are of interest to people at different points in time. And the parties will sometimes view the desirability of the work that you're doing by how they think they can use it to further their own interests. So watch out for whose interests you're serving. And I've got to say, it's not always necessarily the corporate interest that's being served by this work. Finally, make it applied, adaptive, responsive to context and to local demands. And again, make it locally meaningful. That's got to be the end point for discussions around methodology and this kind of work. Just a few quick comments around some of the conceptual work I've been involved in that's being done on understanding intergenerational or long-term community transformations in the Melanesian mining scene. The first is in terms of work with Nick Bainton that seeks to understand better the ways in which in-migration becomes entangled in the sometimes lengthy processes of shifting social relationships and identity within the mining communities. And this graphic to the left is one of the products that we published recently. You'll see that transformation of social relationships and identity sits at the center of that work. There is also work on the various agreement making and political settlements that arise in these situations between communities, companies and states that typically mark out sets of revenue streams, relationships and infrastructure that are expected to persist over multi-decadal mine lives. And I have a continuing interest in what Leah Horowitz has labelled micro-political ecologies in the work of Dora Kerr-Ayers, a recent Papua New Guinean PhD graduate, on shifting community capitals over the course of a mine development. Running through these projects is a concern of mine on the enduring livelihoods, actors and agency of people in these communities, of the continuities and of the local ability and capacity to transform these structural conditions within these communities. In closing then, large-scale mining in Papua New Guinea, as elsewhere, is complex and contested, and it persists. Mines and mining processes enter and overlay pre-existing social, political and cultural forms in different places. I've argued here that we need to see these places as less as sites of conflict and more as sites of transformation, one element of which is conflict. These transformations and continuities extend over decades and generations, and are hard to capture in snapshots. There is a persistence of social and cultural forms and tropes alongside novel forms of economy, inequality and relationships within these decadal transformations. And finally, we need to explore, develop and refine different research methods and ways of working that can match the timeframes that these transformations extend over. Thank you.